Black serial killers, truth or fiction? Americans have a fascination with serial killers. There are books, movies, and television shows about them. The FBI has a special unit that profiles and tracks them. Many of them are household names: Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer. But there is another group of serial killers with even higher body counts, but chances are you've never heard of Samuel Little.
I left her up in that little road up there. On the side of that little road, she was like partially concealed by the vegetation. I left her there.
The Grim Sleeper, the Sunday morning slasher.
Combined, these men have 85 confirmed murders.
But unlike Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer, there are no books, movies, or television shows about these killers. Why? Because they are black serial killers. While movies like The Silence of the Lambs and the television series Dexter focus exclusively on white serial killers, there is so little public information about black serial killers, they are almost a myth. For years, the FBI profile of a typical serial killer described them as white males, 20 to 40 years old, who reside in the area of their murders. But of the roughly 2,000 serial killers believed to be currently active in the United States, it is estimated that roughly 22% are men like Samuel Little, the Grim Sleeper, and the Sunday morning slasher. Black serial killers are no myth.
Prior to my work, there wasn't a whole lot about black serial killers.
Very few people have studied black serial killers. Dr. Alan Branson, a retired police lieutenant investigator with the Philadelphia Police Department and current criminal justice professor at Arcadia University in Philadelphia. He graduated the FBI's National Academy Session 250. His research explores perceptions based on media representations of ethnic groups, as well as the historic, interpersonal, and political discourse that influences communications and the criminal justice process. His doctoral thesis, The Anatomy of African American Serial Killers, a continuum of negative imagery from slavery to prisons, was published in 2016.
Here in Philadelphia, you had Harrison Marty Graham, who I interviewed in 2006.
Harrison Frank Marty Graham was born on September 9, 1959 in Philadelphia. He was the oldest of 5 children. Early on, he showed signs of an intellectual disability, had problems with academic performance and discipline at school. Graham attended high school but was forced to drop out after his sophomore year due to his failing grades and chronic absences. In 1971, his mother would claim that Graham was diagnosed with a mental disorder and spent 2 years in a mental hospital. The claim was never verified. In the early 1970s, Graham started to work in construction. In 1979, he left his parents' house and moved to North Philadelphia. He began to drink alcohol and use drugs. In 1983, Graham rented an apartment in a housing complex with mostly vacant spaces. A number of residents, including Graham himself, fenced off an area of the parking lot as a place to buy and sell drugs. He turned his apartment into a drug den where friends and acquaintances would often visit to buy and use drugs. Graham regularly paid his rent and played basketball with the local youth, living off his disability pension, and was described as a nice man by friends and neighbors. Summer 1987. Graham's neighbors complained to the landlord about a foul odor coming from Graham's apartment. On August 9th, the landlord demands that Graham vacate the premises. Graham refuses to let anyone in, blocking the front door with boards before collecting his personal items and fleeing via the fire escape. Unable to enter the apartment, the landlord calls the police. The police break the door down, finding a naked corpse of a black woman and a partially dressed corpse of another. They also find traces of blood, drugs, and a layer of garbage over a foot high, a pile of dirty mattresses, and a skeleton. In the closet, more remains wrapped in a blanket. While inspecting the roof, investigators find a green duffel bag with the bones of another victim's hands, feet, and legs. An excavation of the basement reveals a skull, rib cage, and pelvic bone belonging to a seventh victim. Since all but 2 of the bodies were in a state of severe decomposition, the police found it difficult to determine their cause of death. The cause of the other 2 was strangulation. Graham was put on the wanted list, and during the following week, he was reportedly seen on public transportation, at fast food restaurants, homeless shelters, and a car wash, but avoided capture each time. On August 17th, Graham tracked down his mother, who after much persuasion convinced him to surrender, after which he called the police. He was arrested the same day, taken to the police station, where he readily confessed to all the killings. In his confession, he explained that he had strangled the 7 women after sharing drugs with them during sex. According to his testimony, he committed the first murder at the end of 1986. He killed one of the victims because she discovered some of the other bodies. A forensic exam partially confirmed his testimony, concluding that 2 recent victims had been strangled 10 days before discovery. The other 5 had been dead for 6 to 12 months. The victims were identified as 27-year-old Cynthia Brooks, 25-year-old Valerie Jameson, 36-year-old Mary Jeter Mathis, 22-year-old Barbara Mahoney, 29-year-old Robin DeShazor, 33-year-old Sandra Garvin, and 24-year-old Patricia Franklin. During the investigation, it was established that Robin DeShazor was Graham's longtime girlfriend. Harrison's mother told police that in 1981, after an argument with her son, she visited his apartment, where Robin DeShazor was living with him. March 7, 1988. Graham refused a jury trial during preliminary court hearings, but he fully admitted his guilt. His lawyer pleaded for a lenient sentence while the prosecutor demanded the death penalty. According to Graham's attorney, due to his intellectual disability, Graham could not distinguish right from wrong. This, along with his heavy drug use, made him act on impulse and without self-control. While the proceedings were taking place, Graham appeared to be completely calm. On April 28, 1988, Graham was found guilty on all charges, receiving 6 death sentences and 1 life imprisonment term for the murders. As a leniency, the court ruled that Graham's death sentence would only be carried out after he served his life sentence. This meant he would never be executed. After the trial, Graham asked his lawyer to give him back his Cookie Monster doll, which was seized from him after his arrest. Graham had been attached to the doll for years, one of the few items he took with him when he escaped his apartment.
Every portrayal of him, Cookie Monster, Gentle Giant, all this stuff, was of an individual who was lacking certain cognitive skills. But by the time I saw him in prison, he had been dried out for a long time. And so when I conducted my interview with him, I found him to be very lucid. He was very much aware of the things that he's done. Out of all the serial killers, 1 out of 5 is African American. And then that's 20% of the overall population. But blacks only make up 13% of the population of the United States. So that was like a starting point for me.
Studies of black serial killers and their cases are essential, since they provide a better understanding of criminal behavior across racial groups. They also help us figure out the causes and consequences of criminal behavior, and develop effective prevention and profiling strategies.
On one hand, I would hope that it would help create a safer environment just in terms of law enforcement. It could have a pile-on effect of, oh, so now they're serial killing too. You know what I mean? So, because somebody asked me, like, well, why would you do something about African American? Like, don't we have enough negative imagery? And I was reminded of, there's a quote by John Kennedy, who was at the Waldorf Astoria, and he was talking to the National Press Corps. And he said that, the dangers of excessive secrecy are far outweighed by the rationalizations that we use to justify them. And as somebody in law enforcement, I'm very well aware of being an African-American male and so forth, but I also am aware of crime, and I couldn't look at the statistics of African Americans engaged in violent, murderous acts and assume, well, when it comes to serial killing, I guess they're just drawing a line. That's just something they won't do. In terms of law enforcement, you have to look at society as a whole. Like, if one member of society is a victim, then we're all victims. And the thing that was so fascinating when I did my research was how white serial killers were almost seen as anti-heroes, whereas obviously African Americans cannot be anti-heroes. You can look at television, you could look at something like The Sopranos, and here's a guy who's in a mob, but he's this anti-hero. He's the guy that you root for, right? You didn't feel the same way when you watched The Wire. These were just thugs in the streets of Baltimore. You know what I mean? So it's interesting in the history of America how white males have been portrayed as these heroes or anti-heroes, even when they've done heinous things. Our portrayal of the cowboy. Cowboy, the wild, wild west, all this stuff. You're slaughtering Indians. How do you become a hero out of that? So it's a very interesting thing. I don't know if they say now as much. I mean, I do know that researchers have caught on, and I don't think so much now it is a portrayal African-American serial killers as being dim-witted and so forth, but I mean, we can't ignore the history of African-Americans in general as being seen as dim-witted.
The Jim Crow laws, the racial caste system which existed primarily in southern and border states of the United States between 1877 and the mid-1960s. This was following the end of the Reconstruction period and after the American Civil War. During this time, southern states enacted laws known as Jim Crow laws, which mandated racial segregation in public facilities, transportation, education, and more. These laws were enforced by both legal means and social customs, creating a deeply entrenched system of racial inequality and oppression. Jim Crow was more than a series of rigid anti-black laws. It was a way of life. Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-black racism. Many Christian ministers and theologians taught that white people were the chosen people, black people were cursed to be servants, and God supported racial segregation. Pro-segregation politicians gave eloquent speeches on the great danger of integration, the mongrelization of the white race. Newspapers and magazine writers routinely referred to black people as niggers, coons, and darkies. Worse, their articles reinforced anti-black stereotypes. The portrayal of African Americans in the media during the Jim Crow era was heavily influenced by racial stereotypes and biases. Media, including newspapers, magazines, films, and even cartoons, propagated harmful images and narratives that reinforced negative stereotypes about black people. These portrayals often depict blacks as unintelligent, lazy, and criminal. One notorious example is the blackface minstrel shows. White performers would paint their faces black and imitate exaggerated, offensive versions of black people, reinforcing racial prejudices and demeaning black culture. These shows shaped public perceptions and attitudes towards African Americans. As a result, blacks were portrayed as lazy, ignorant, and inferior, creating a lasting legacy of racism and discrimination. These stereotypes have devastated black communities and contributed to systematic racism. The latter half of the 20th century saw significant shifts in media portrayals of blacks. This was driven by changing societal norms, civil rights movements, and black artists and activists. This shift in media representation had direct impact on the way blacks were viewed in the public eye. It created a more positive and nuanced image of blacks in the media. This was a crucial factor in the fight for equal rights and recognition for African Americans. The civil rights movement brought attention to racial segregation and discrimination injustices. Media coverage of protests, marches, and speeches by leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped humanize black struggles and challenge negative stereotypes. This helped bring about positive changes such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws made it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their race or religion and granted blacks the right to vote. In the 1970s, the blaxploitation film genre emerged, featuring predominantly black casts and stories that celebrated black culture and empowerment. Films like Shaft and Superfly offered a counter-narrative to earlier negative portrayals. The genre has been credited with paving the way for future black filmmakers and actors, and its influence can still be seen in today's films. The blaxploitation era was a significant milestone in Hollywood's representation history. As black characters took on more diverse and positive roles in the media, the concept of positive role models emerged. Media began to reflect black community diversity in terms of gender, sexuality, social economic status, and more. This shift in representation has helped to challenge and disrupt negative stereotypes of blacks. This has led to increased acceptance and understanding of the black community in society. It has also inspired pride among blacks, allowing them to feel seen and valued in the media. Despite these positive developments, challenges persist in media representation. Black characters are often portrayed as one-dimensional roles and are disproportionately depicted in negative contexts. Although it appears to be counterintuitive, the general lack of acceptance of black serial killers is largely due to America's long, troubled, and complicated history with race and the perpetuation of white supremacy. With the long-held stereotypes that have portrayed black males as brutes and criminals, it is ironic that the media, police, and public have largely failed to recognize that serial murders also come from the black community. The media's portrayal of serial killers, particularly emphasizing white serial killers, can have several effects. Overemphasis on white serial killers can reinforce stereotypes and biases, leading some individuals to associate serial killings more strongly with a particular racial or ethnic group. This can contribute to racial profiling and discrimination. Focusing primarily on white serial killers can misrepresent the reality that serial killers come from a diverse racial backgrounds. This can hinder efforts to understand and prevent serial killings by obscuring the true scope of the problem. If the public believes serial killers are primarily white, it might lead to policy responses that don't adequately address the issues in all communities.
1974 marked the establishment of the Behavioral Science Unit within the FBI. The FBI established the BSU as part of the training division of the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Initially, it was a small unit consisting of a few agents and researchers. It was created in response to a growing need for a specialized unit that could help investigate serial and violent crimes. Its primary mission was to provide behavioral analysis and psychological profiling to law enforcement agencies to assist them in solving complex crimes.
The FBI's, there was a behavioral science unit, but before the behavioral science unit, they had to find out how to profile. And it's actually talked about in a book by Don DeNevy and John Campbell called Into the Minds of Madmen. They went to a Greenwich Village psychiatrist by the name of James Brussels, who basically taught them the profiling method. And how he came to prominence was he profiled a guy by the name of George Metesky, who was a mad bomber in New York City. He was a former Con Edison worker who was disgruntled. And this guy had set off numerous bombs throughout the city. When Brussels did his profile, he said that the guy would probably live on the outskirts, that he would be like buttoned up, very tight, very conservative. And in fact, he was. If we go further, just in terms of profiling, which we now call criminal investigative analysis, you could look at Captain Ellis Zachariah, who requested a profile on Adolf Hitler because he wanted to know what Hitler would do when he was cornered. And basically the profile came back, and I believe C.W. Langer did the profile, said that he'd scorch the earth.
The director of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, William D. Donovan, initiated the psychological profile of Adolf Hitler, often referred to as the Langer Report. Donovan recognized the importance of understanding Adolf Hitler's psychological makeup to gain insights into his decision-making processes and strategic thinking during World War II. Walter C. Langer, a prominent American psychoanalyst, was tasked by Donovan with creating a psychological assessment of Hitler in 1943. Langer assembled a team of psychologists, historians, and other experts to analyze Hitler's speeches, writings, and available information. This was done to construct a psychological profile of the Nazi leader. Hitler's extreme narcissism and grandiose self-image were central to his personality. He believed he was uniquely destined to lead Germany to greatness. He considered himself a visionary leader who could reshape the world according to his ideology. This sense of superiority allowed him to dismiss opposing viewpoints and surround himself with individuals who reinforced his beliefs. His grandiose self-image gave him a misguided sense of invincibility and strength, leading him to make reckless decisions and ultimately resulted in his downfall. Hitler's thirst for absolute control over both the Nazi Party and the German state led to authoritarian leadership. By tapping into people's hopes and desires, he gained a large following and eventually took control of the country. Understanding Hitler's psychological traits requires considering his life experiences, his upbringing, and the broader historical context. His experiences as a soldier during World War I, coupled with his disappointment in the Treaty of Versailles, shaped his resentment and the desire for revenge. Post-war Germany's social and economic climate provided fertile ground for extremist ideologies. As a precursor to modern psychological analysis, the Langer Report was the first attempt to predict and understand a prominent figure's behavior, paving the way for criminal profiling.
The term serial killer is most commonly credited to former FBI Special Agent Robert Ressler. He used the term serial homicide in 1974 in a lecture at the Police Staff Academy in the UK. His pioneering work on behavioral psychology not only popularized the term, but gave serial killings recognizable criteria that could be applied to the practice of criminal profiling.
The FBI has actually changed their definition of serial murder. I believe the federal law, which I can't see how that was enacted without FBI's influence in '83. The federal law still says 3 or more. I think in 2005, they had a symposium in Texas, the FBI, and they changed it to 2 or more. The only problem I have with that is that increases who you count as a serial murder if it's 2 or more in a cooling off period. I tend to think of it as still 3 or more, but I'm not the FBI. And, they have the floor. But, they changed it from 3 or more to 2 or more. But in terms of evolving, it's a very proactive law enforcement agency. At this point, they probably have black criminal investigative analysis, and I'm sure they've sort of righted the ship. There's a few assumptions that are made. First of all, that black serial killers will only kill black people, which is nonsense.
Victimology is the study of victimization, including the psychological effects of victims, the relationship between victims and the offenders, the interaction between victims and the criminal justice system, that is, the police and courts and corrections officials, and the connections between victims and other social groups and institutions, such as the media, businesses, and social movements.
In terms of victimology, in all serial murders, there's always what I think of as the X factor or victim X. So the typical victim is what society might deem as throwaway people nobody cares about, all right? Until you kill someone that people do care about, then the investigation starts. We saw it with John Wayne Gacy. He's killing a bunch of young males. He killed Robert Piest. Robert Piest's parents cared about him. Robert Piest was about to go to college. And then he's arrested. We saw it with Albert Fish. Albert Fish killed as many as 300 black children in the Washington, D.C. area. Who knows that, right? So anyway, kills approximately 300 black children. But it isn't until he kills Grace Budd, a little white girl in New York, based on somebody in her family, her brother, answering an ad because he needed a helper. He goes in, he sees her as these victims. He says, "Oh, I can take her to a party," and the parents go, "Okay, yeah, it's fine. He's got a lot of money. He seems like a decent guy." So the victimology plays into all of it. And if the victims are not cared about, it's not like law enforcement doesn't have its hands full every day. Unless somebody cares about you, your investigation could very well fall to the wayside unless you are a person or a group with agency or people care about you.
Criminal profiling is a process now known as criminal investigative analysis. Profilers or criminal investigative analysts are highly trained and experienced law enforcement officers who study every behavioral aspect in detail of a violent crime scene. The primary goal is to assist investigators in solving crimes, especially those involving violent or serial offenders. This is done by providing insights into the offender's personality, motivations, and potential future actions.
This is one thing that I would like to make clear in terms of criminal investigative analysis. It is deductive guesswork. Human beings are too individual to clearly be able to say why someone is motivated to do. We can speculate. All right, so with the older woman, is it something against his mother? I mean, it all starts out in the family circle. Is it something that happened to them, usually traumatic, early on, that they're getting back at? Or does that person symbolize something to them? We can never really know what motivates, I don't know what you're going to do when you leave here. We don't know, but all we can do is make intelligent sort of deductions based on what we do know. And I think for most people that engage in sort of this sort of research, we convince ourselves that we know a lot more than we do. We look at patterns, we create categories, taxonomies, and all that kind of stuff, and we think we know some stuff. And then somebody comes along, and we don't know everything. Like the whole thing with the DC sniper. They thought they knew everything. They thought they knew everything, but apparently you didn't.
The DC sniper case, also known as the Beltway sniper attacks, involved a series of shootings in the Washington, D.C. area in October 2002. The perpetrators were John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. The pair targeted victims randomly, killing 10 people and injuring 3 others. John Allen Muhammad was born on December 31, 1960 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Muhammad was a U.S. Army veteran of the Gulf War. He later had a troubled personal life and faced financial difficulties. He developed a deep resentment toward society and is believed to have been the driving force behind the shooting spree that terrorized the D.C. area. Lee Boyd Malvo was John Allen Muhammad's accomplice in the D.C. sniper attacks. He was born February 18, 1985 in Kingston, Jamaica. Malvo's background is troubled. He met John Allen Muhammad in Antigua in 2001, and the two formed a pseudo-father-son relationship. Muhammad, who was much older than Malvo, exerted a strong influence on him. John Allen Muhammad was known to be a manipulative and abusive mentor to Malvo and was largely responsible for Malvo's involvement in the DC sniper attacks. Malvo had never been convicted of a crime prior to the attacks. During the attacks, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo carried out sniper shootings targeting random individuals. The shootings resulted in multiple deaths and injuries, causing panic and fear in the community. The attacks lasted 3 weeks and left the community shocked. The attacks were calculated and random at the same time, meaning no one felt safe. This created paranoia and anxiety, as anyone could be a target. The shootings made it impossible for people to live without fear. Muhammad and Malvo used a Chevrolet Caprice as a mobile sniper's nest. They modified the car's trunk to allow them to shoot from within without being easily detected. They would choose random victims from various locations, creating a pattern of seemingly unrelated shootings. The attacks began on October 2, 2002, with the fatal shooting of a man in a parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland. Over the next 3 weeks, shootings occurred at various locations, including parking lots, gas stations, and shopping centers. often targeting victims who were going about their daily routines. Muhammad and Malvo left messages at several crime scenes demanding a large sum of money, along with threats of additional violence if the demands were not met. This led to speculation about possible motivations behind the attacks. Local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals, launched a massive joint investigation. They conducted extensive forensic analysis, reviewed surveillance footage, and gathered evidence from crime scenes. Authorities issued public alerts and urged residents to be vigilant and report any suspicious activities. The sniper attacks led to changes in daily routines, with many people avoiding public places and changing their behavior out of fear. The breakthrough in the case came when citizens reported seeing a suspicious vehicle, a blue Chevrolet Caprice with New Jersey license plates, at one of the shooting scenes in Maryland. This tip proved critical in narrowing the focus of the investigation. On October 24, 2002, police located the suspected vehicle at a rest area in Maryland. They arrested the two occupants, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. They were found to have a high-powered rifle and other weapons in their possession. As the investigation progressed, it was revealed that John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo had carried out the attacks as part of a plan to extort money and create fear. Their motivations appeared to be a combination of financial gain and a desire to carry out a series of random killings. In 2003, Muhammad was convicted of multiple charges, including murder and terrorism. He was sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on November 10, 2009 in Virginia. Malvo was charged and tried as an adult in several jurisdictions. He was eventually convicted in Virginia for his role in the sniper shootings. In 2004, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The revelation that the DC snipers were not white serial killers contributed to a broader understanding that serial killers could come from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. This realization helped challenge the oversimplified narrative perpetuated by the media and popular culture.
Here you had an African-American chief of police, as well as the former chief here, who both claimed something to the effect that in the annals of criminal history, we have never seen a black serial killer. And I was thinking, well, somebody should have told Clarence Hill that back in 1939. This is how racism is poisonous, because we make assumptions, just like white people make assumptions about who can kill, who doesn't kill, and all that kind of stuff. And so when I heard that, I just thought, like why would you say that? So clearly, because of sexual homicide patterns and motives, sort of concept of what a serial killer is. So black people were left out of it. Now you could just imagine during that, during the DC Sniper Task Force investigation, if somebody said, listen, you know what? I think it's two black guys riding around in a mobile sniper's nest going state to state, starting in Washington state and just shooting people. They would have looked at him like he was crazy, or her, and said, you know what, do me a favor, just go get some coffee and some donuts, and we'll be fine.
Move along, kiddo.
But the point is, it was so ingrained. Now here's the significance of looking at the possibility of a black serial killer. How many lives might have been saved? DC Sniper, he didn't care who his victims were. He was killing white people, he was killing black people, shooting kids. He didn't care. So that's when we start saying things like only certain people engage in certain kind of crimes, we're like opening ourselves up for like a world of hurt. And if you look at Samuel Little, he's a sick fuck.
And tell me about where you met her at.
I seen her down at the Guar on 17th Avenue, and she had on a short cream miniskirt. My stepdad's car, Pontiac Le Mans.
And where did you take her to?
Continue down 27. Got back on 27.
Going outside of Miami. Okay.
Miami.
Going away from Miami.
Going away from Miami. And I seen a road going off the main road back into vegetation on the left side. So I got her out of the car, pulled her out, and drug her into the growth back there.
Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. His mother, Bessie Mae Little, was a 16-year-old prostitute, and his father, Paul McDowell, was a 19-year-old. Little's family moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was raised mainly by his grandmother. He attended Hawthorne Junior High School, where he had problems with discipline and achievement. By his own account, he began having sexual fantasies about strangling women as a child, starting when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her neck. As a teenager, he collected true crime magazines depicting women being choked. He eventually dropped out of school and took up amateur boxing with dreams of becoming like his hero, Sugar Ray Robinson. As a light heavyweight prize fighter, he was known for his speed and earned the nicknames Mad Daddy and Mad Machine. He used these skills to murder. He knocked out his female victims with one punch before strangling them. He often disposed of bodies in secluded areas to evade detection. His choice of victims and his transient lifestyle helped him remain under the radar for decades. He traveled extensively throughout the United States. This allowed him to commit murders in different states and jurisdictions. Samuel Little's crimes were characterized by consistency. He typically targeted marginalized and vulnerable women, such as prostitutes, drug addicts, and those living on the fringes of society. These victims often have unstable lifestyles, which unfortunately made them less likely to be reported missing or attract significant attention from law enforcement. In 2012, Samuel Little was arrested on unrelated charges in a homeless shelter in Kentucky. His DNA was collected as part of a standard procedure. This led to a match with DNA evidence from 3 unsolved murder cases in Los Angeles dating back to the 1980s. He was extradited to California to face trial for these murders. In 2014, Little was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. While he was already behind bars for these crimes, investigators and law enforcement officials dug deeper into his past. In 2018, law enforcement began connecting Samuel Little to additional unsolved murder cases across the country. Investigators found his confessions remarkably detailed.
Well, tell me about this girl. What does she look like?
She was kind of thin, dark skinned, about 40 years old when she was out there hustling. I think she was a drug addict because she wouldn't have been out there.
How tall was she?
She was about 5'5", 5'3".
They included descriptions of the victims, the circumstances surrounding the murders, and even sketches of the women he claimed to have killed. These confessions often matched unsolved cases, adding credibility to his claims. Samuel Little's case highlights several significant issues in criminal justice and law enforcement. It underscores the difficulties in identifying and solving serial killings, particularly when the victims are marginalized or overlooked by society. The case also raises questions about confession accuracy, as well as the need for corroborating evidence to ensure their reliability. Little's death in 2020 marked the end of his reign of terror and the closure of any further legal proceedings against him. However, the impact of his crimes continue to reverberate through the lives of the victims' families and the communities affected by his actions. Samuel Little had a photographic memory that recalls his victims' faces and body types. He also remembers specific details of the location of his crimes. For example, how many arches were on a building or how far down a road he would drive until he reached the exact spot to dump the body. He confessed to 90 murders, 65 confirmed, making him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history.
North Little Rock. Tell me what that girl looked like.
Oh man, I loved her. I forget her name. Oh wait, I think it was Ruth.
And then when you hear these interviews, like there's no remorse whatsoever. Here's the thing. When you start talking about body counts, you start talking about numbers and stuff like that, and it's not, there are so many who we don't know. Coral Watts may have as many as Samuel Little.
Coral Eugene Watts led a troubled and disturbed life marked by criminal activities, violence, and murders. Born in Killeen, Texas to Richard Eugene Watts and Dorothy Mae Young on November 7, 1953, his father was a private first class in the Army and his mother was an art teacher. Watts' parents divorced before his second birthday. He stayed with his mother. In 1962, Dorothy Mae Watts married Norman Caesar. They moved to Michigan, where she found employment as a high school art teacher. Watts disliked his new stepfather, which made it difficult to adapt to his surroundings. He claimed that he was called a mama's boy and often worried about losing his mother's attention. The family frequently visited Dorothy's family in Coalwood, West Virginia, where Dorothy was born and raised. In the woods near his grandparents' home, Watts learned to hunt. He adopted the nickname Coral as a result of his passion for the southern town and his native cousins. Watts and his sister contracted meningitis when he was 8 years old. It nearly killed him, caused him to be held back a year and miss the 3rd grade. After his illness, his family members noticed a change in his personality, describing him as bashful, quiet, and introverted. His attention span dropped and he suffered from poor memory. He struggled to keep up when he returned to school since he had been held back 1 grade, and he suffered from chronic insomnia due to his illness. He started having violent dreams about battling off and killing women's wicked spirits, which interrupted his sleep cycle. When detectives questioned him about his crimes and asked him why he killed women, he responded that he wanted to free their spirits because they had evil eyes. By 12 years old, he said he enjoyed sleep-induced fantasies of torturing and killing girls and young women. Teenage Watts started stalking girls, and it's thought he killed his first victim before 15. He frequently received failing grades in school, and by 16, he could only read at a 4th grade level. He was also severely bullied at school. Police identified 15-year-old Watts as a suspect in the assault of 26-year-old Joan Gave on June 29, 1969. While delivering newspapers on his route, Watts knocked on Gave's apartment door, entered, and abused her violently. He then continued on his delivery route as if nothing had happened. Gave immediately contacted the authorities, who apprehended Watts at his home. He was ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment at the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit, a mental hospital. Watts graduated from high school in 1973 at the age of 19 and was given a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, despite his subpar grades and sporadic drug use after release from the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit. Watts said exercising allowed him to let out suppressed rage. He achieved stardom as a football player and even greater success in boxing, becoming a Golden Gloves fighter. After just 3 months, he was dismissed from Lane College after being charged with stalking and assaulting women. He briefly resided in Houston, Texas following his expulsion, and then spent a year working as a mechanic for a Detroit wheel manufacturer. In 1974, when he entered Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, a string of heinous assaults and attacks on women started to occur. Watts is suspected of murdering numerous women, though he was convicted of only a few crimes. He was often called the Sunday morning slasher due to his preference for attacking his victims on weekend mornings. He committed murders in Michigan, Texas, Illinois, Wisconsin, and is suspected of murders in New York and New Jersey. In 1974, Watts was arrested for Linda Tilley's murder, but he was released due to a lack of evidence. In 1979, Watts was arrested for the murder of Helen Dutcher. He was convicted of burglary with intent to murder and sentenced to prison. However, this conviction did not directly link him to his other suspected murders. The fact that Watts operated for years without being apprehended speaks to his ability to blend into his surroundings and evade suspicion. Serial killers like Watts often exhibit cunning and manipulation to avoid detection. This can frustrate law enforcement efforts and leave communities in fear. He used people's trust to hide his activities. When law enforcement efforts increased, he could slip away and continue undetected. Watts' arrest and subsequent legal proceedings highlighted the challenge of building a solid case against a serial killer. In 1982, he was arrested after breaking into a woman's home to murder her. He was convicted of burglary with intent to murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. While in prison, Watts provided information about his involvement in a series of unsolved murders to law enforcement agencies. He confessed to some of these crimes and described his methods. However, not all of his confessions resulted in formal convictions due to the challenges of gathering evidence for crimes that had occurred years earlier across multiple states. Due to the controversial plea deal, he only confessed to a limited number of additional murders. This plea deal allowed him to avoid the death penalty and receive a relatively short sentence compared to the extent of his suspected crimes. The plea deal and his subsequent sentence generated significant controversy and outrage, both from the victims' families and the public at large. It raised questions about the justice system's ability to adequately punish serial killers and provide closure for victims' families. This case underscores the difficult decisions prosecutors often face when dealing with serial killers who provide information in exchange for reduced sentences. The victims' families were understandably upset, feeling justice had not been served. Coral Watt's death from prostate cancer in 2007 further complicated the situation. Some of his victims' families felt justice was denied because he was never held accountable for all suspected murders. The true extent of Watt's crimes may never be known, leaving lingering questions and unfinished business for the families affected.
So they talk about Marty Graham, like, how stupid he was. Now, they found bodies in his closet. He moved the body from the roof because birds were making too much noise, pecking at it and stuff like that. But yeah, could he tell you anything about the Pythagorean theorem? Probably not. But if he's successful in his predations, then that's all that matters. You know what I mean? So when we say an intelligent, serial killer, like, what's your measure of intelligence? Because all we're talking about is whether somebody is successful at their predations. The image that has been portrayed through Silence of the Lambs and all that is, the guy listens to classical music, has gourmet meals, and all that kind of stuff. So that's an image that has been built up by the media. But in terms of what's intelligent enough, if you are a successful predator, you are, by definition, intelligent.
Black serial killers do exist. They have and will continue to kill. Whether we acknowledge them or not, the knowledge of their existence can save lives. The study of them can lead to the capture of these serial killers.
She was a heavy-set, big old yellow gal, and had buck teeth. It had a gap between the teeth, that's what it was. We stayed together 2 days or more. I think it was about 3 days. We was going shoplifting. We went to Sears. We went to Kroger's, and that's where I got busted. Mm-hmm.